The light at the end of the tunnel was supposed to mean freedom, but for Miguel Torres, it meant the beginning of a different kind of burial. After 3 hours of crawling through mud and darkness, his knees raw and bleeding, his lungs burning from the stale air, he emerged not into American freedom, but into the waiting arms of Border Patrol agents who'd been watching the tunnel exit all along. The transition from underground grave to above-ground cage took less than 5 minutes. The memory would last forever. But to understand how 12 desperate people ended up crawling through a smuggling tunnel that led straight to capture, you need to go back to that night in Juarez when desperation made even obviously doomed plans seem reasonable. Miguel had been stuck in the border city for 2 months, watching his money disappear into overpriced rooms and meals while he searched for a way across. At 32, he was older than most attempting their first crossing, but the gangs in El Salvador had finally made staying impossible. The choice was join them, die by them, or flee. He chose flight, selling a small car repair shop, and heading north with $8,000 and a photo of his daughter who died 3 years earlier. His reminder why life mattered even when it seemed worthless. The coyote who approached him at the migrant shelter seemed different from the others. Quieter, more professional, less interested in immediate payment than in finding the right people for a special opportunity. He introduced himself as Chino and spoke of a tunnel that had been operating successfully for months. Not one of the narco tunnels used for drugs. Those were too dangerous, too watched. This was smaller, designed specifically for human passage. The pitch was compelling. No desert crossing with its risks of dehydration and death. No river with its currents and drownings. Just 3 hours of discomfort underground, then emergence into America, where a van would be waiting. $5,000 per person, groups of 12 maximum to avoid detection. They'd cross hundreds successfully. Tonight could be Miguel's turn. He should have asked why. If hundreds had crossed successfully, Chino was recruiting at shelters instead of working through established networks. Should have wondered why the price was lower than most coyotes charge for riskier routes. Should have trusted the instinct that whispered warnings he chose to ignore. But 2 months of waiting had worn down his caution, and the tunnel sounded safer than the alternatives. The group assembled at midnight in a warehouse that smelled of motor oil and fear. 12 people ranging from teenagers to a grandmother who clutched rosary beads like lifelines. There were 2 families, parents with children old enough to crawl but young enough to still believe in their parents' promises of better lives. 3 single men like Miguel, worn down by violence or poverty, or both. 2 women traveling together, sisters from Honduras who held hands like they were afraid of being separated by more than distance. Chino explained the process with the efficiency of someone who'd given this speech many times. The tunnel entrance was hidden in an abandoned house's basement. They'd crawl single file, no talking, no lights except small LED keychain flashlights he provided. The tunnel was reinforced, ventilated, safe. 3 hours of crawling, then freedom. The van would take them to El Paso safe houses, then disperse to their final destinations. He collected money with the same efficiency. Cash only, counted twice, no receipts. Miguel handed over $5,000, more than half his remaining funds, and received a small flashlight and a number. He was 7th in line. Remember your position. Don't deviate. Trust the process. The abandoned house sat in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, the kind of place where people minded their own business because everyone's business was suspicious. They entered through a back door that scraped against warped floorboards, descended stairs that creaked with every step. The tunnel entrance was a hole in the basement floor, maybe 3 feet in diameter, reinforced with scavenged wood and metal. A ladder descended into darkness that seemed to swallow light. The first person, a young man who volunteered to lead, disappeared down it with barely a sound. Then the second, then the families, parents helping children who suddenly understood this wasn't adventure, but something darker. When Miguel's turn came, he almost backed out. The hole looked like a grave, smelled like earth and decay and something else, maybe fear soaked in the soil by everyone who'd passed through before. But the woman behind him was already waiting, the momentum of the group pushing forward, and backing out now would mean admitting the money was gone for nothing. The ladder ended 10 feet down in a space barely large enough to stand hunched over. The tunnel itself stretched ahead, a black throat maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Wooden boards and metal sheeting formed walls that looked one good shake from collapse. The person ahead was already crawling, their body blocking most of the passage, feet disappearing into darkness. Miguel dropped to his knees and began to crawl. The first 100 yards weren't terrible. The tunnel was dry, the air stale but breathable. His keychain light showed walls that had been carved with some care, even some expertise. This wasn't a rush job, but something that had taken time, planning, investment. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made him wonder who had the resources for such construction and why they were selling passage for just $5,000. As they went deeper, conditions deteriorated. The dry earth became mud that soaked through his jeans, coating his hands and knees with slime that smelled of sewage. The careful construction gave way to rougher digging, sharp rocks that tore clothing and skin. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, like sucking oxygen through a wet cloth. Sounds carried strangely underground. He could hear the person ahead, one of the fathers, breathing heavily, occasionally cursing when he hit his head on a low-hanging support. Behind him, the older woman whispered prayers in a steady rhythm that might have been comforting if it hadn't sounded so much like last rites. Time became meaningless in the tunnel. Had they been crawling for an hour? 2? His watch was somewhere in the mud, torn off by a protruding root or rock. His knees screamed with each forward movement. His back ached from the hunched position. His hands were so covered in mud, he couldn't feel individual fingers anymore. Then the person ahead stopped. In the confined space, the sudden halt created a chain reaction. Miguel's face nearly collided with the father's muddy boots. Behind him, the grandmother ran into his own feet. Whispers traveled down the line. What was wrong? Why had they stopped? The only answer was silence from ahead. Minutes passed. The air seemed to get thicker, harder to breathe. Someone further back started to panic, their breathing rapid and loud in the enclosed space. Miguel wanted to turn around, to see what was happening, but the tunnel was too narrow. They were committed to forward or backward as a group, and right now, they were doing neither. Finally, movement. Slow at first, then regular crawling pace again. But something had changed. The careful order of their progression had been disrupted. People were crawling faster, driven by panic or desperation, or the growing certainty that something was wrong. The 3-hour timeline had surely passed, but still they crawled through endless darkness. The mud gave way to water. Not much at first, just puddles that soaked through already wet clothing. Then deeper, a steady stream that must have come from some underground source or leak. Cold water that made the crawling even more miserable, that turned the tunnel floor into a slippery mess where maintaining forward progress became a battle. Miguel's flashlight died. The tiny LED that had provided psychological more than practical illumination flickered once and went dark. Now he was crawling blind, following the sound ahead. Trying not to think about the tons of earth above or the possibility that the tunnel had no end, that they'd crawl until exhaustion took them and they became permanent residents of this underground grave. Then impossibly light, real light, not the weak glow of flashlights, but something stronger filtering down from above. The line started moving faster, people suddenly energized by the possibility of escape. The tunnel began sloping upward, the ceiling rising enough that they could crawl on hands and feet instead of bellies. More light, an opening ahead, a circle of bright illumination that hurt eyes accustomed to darkness. The first person reached it, pulled themselves up and out, then the second, then the families. Children cried with relief as they emerged. Miguel's turn came and he grabbed the edges of the exit, hauling his mud-covered body up into blinding American sunlight and directly into custody. They emerged inside a cage. Chain-link fence topped with razor wire, maybe 20 feet square, with a dozen Border Patrol agents waiting outside it. The agents looked bored, like they'd been expecting this exact group at this exact time. Some held cameras, documenting each person as they crawled from the tunnel into captivity. The tunnel exit was in a cleared area maybe 50 yards from the actual border fence. Still technically in the United States, but in a zone completely controlled by Border Patrol. The entire area was under surveillance. Cameras on poles, motion sensors, probably seismic equipment that had detected their underground passage from the moment they'd entered. Chino had sent them crawling straight into a trap. The agents were efficient, but not cruel. Handed out water bottles and emergency blankets to people who looked like they'd been buried and partially exhumed. Separated men from women and children, documented everyone with photos and fingerprints. The grandmother was taken away in an ambulance. 3 hours of crawling had been too much for her heart. The children were processed separately. Their parents pleased to stay together, ignored with bureaucratic indifference. Miguel sat in the cage with the other men, looking at the tunnel exit they crawled from. Such a small hole to have swallowed so much hope. His money was gone. His knees were torn and possibly infected. His chance at America had ended 20 feet after it began. And somewhere in Mexico, Chino was probably recruiting the next group of desperate people to crawl through the same tunnel into the same cage. An agent who spoke Spanish explained what would happen. Processing at the detention center. Deportation proceedings. Since this was their first capture, they'd likely be sent back to Mexico within days. Future attempts would result in criminal prosecution. The tunnel would be sealed, though another would probably open within weeks. The game would continue with new players, but the same ending. The detention center was a converted warehouse filled with chain link holding areas that looked like the cage they'd emerged into, just indoors. Hundreds of people in various stages of processing, some still in muddy clothes from river crossings, others clean and resigned after days or weeks of waiting. Miguel was assigned a number, a thin mat, a foil blanket, and a place in line for everything from food to phone calls to deportation. He met others who'd been caught in various ways. Some had walked for days through the desert only to be picked up by sensors and drones. Others had hidden in vehicles that were searched at checkpoints. A few had crossed successfully and lived in America for years before a traffic stop or workplace raid had ended their dreams. All of them were now reduced in numbers in a system designed to process human hope into statistical despair. The tunnel group was something of a curiosity. Other detainees asked about it. How long was it? How deep? How much had they paid? The details spread to the detention center, becoming another cautionary tale in a place full of them. Some laughed at the naivety. Others sympathized, understanding how desperation can make obvious traps look like opportunities. Miguel learned the truth from a guard who took pity on him, or maybe just enjoyed revealing the extent of their failure. The tunnel had been discovered months ago. Instead of sealing it immediately, Border Patrol had decided to monitor it, let operate, capture everyone who emerged. Easier than finding new tunnels. More efficient than chasing people through the desert. Just wait at the exit and collect whoever Chino or his successor sent through. They'd probably captured hundreds this way. 12 more every few nights, crawling toward freedom and finding custody. The agents knew when groups were coming. Seismic sensors detected the movement underground. They'd sit in air-conditioned vehicles, watching monitors, waiting for the desperate to deliver themselves. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just the capture, but the hope allowed to flourish during those 3 hours underground. Every painful meter crawled was toward a freedom that had never existed. Every dollar paid was for passage to a cage. The tunnel was real. The crossing was real. Only the destination was a lie. Miguel was deported 5 days later. Bus to the border, walk across the bridge, released into Mexico with a paper saying he couldn't return for 5 years. He stood on the Mexican side, looking back at America, knowing there was a tunnel under the ground he stood on that led nowhere good. Knowing people were probably crawling through it right now, following their small lights toward bigger lies. He returned to El Salvador eventually. The gangs who'd driven him away had moved on to other territories or been killed by rivals. His repair shop was gone, sold to fund a journey that ended in a cage. He found work with a mechanic who'd also been deported, fixing cars for people who could still afford to drive. Sometimes he dreamed about the tunnel. Not nightmares exactly, just memories of darkness and mud and the weight of earth above, of crawling toward light that turned out to be capture, of discovering that some passages led not to new lives but to the end of old ones, that some lights at the end of tunnels were just spotlights illuminating your failure. The scar tissue on his knees never faded completely. Pink patches of skin that ached when weather changed, reminders of 3 hours spent crawling through mud toward imprisonment. He'd see young men preparing to head north and want to warn them about tunnels and cages, and the ways hope could be weaponized against you. But he usually stayed quiet. Everyone had to learn their own lessons about borders and the prices of crossing them. Years later, he heard the tunnel had finally been sealed, concrete pumped into it, filling the passage where so many had crawled toward dreams that ended in custody. But others had opened, would always open, as long as people were desperate enough to pay for passage through darkness. The game continued with new tunnels, new cages, new groups of 12 crawling toward lights that meant capture rather than freedom. Miguel Torres had paid $5,000 to crawl for 3 hours through a smuggling tunnel. He'd emerged not into America, but into a cage where Border Patrol agents waited with water bottles and deportation papers. The tunnel had been real. The crossing had been real. Only the promise of freedom had been a lie, sold to desperate people who believed anything that offered hope. He lived with that knowledge now, carried it like the scars on his knees. Some borders were made of fences and walls. Others were made of the tunnels beneath them that led nowhere. He crawled through both and found only that some journeys ended not with arrival, but with the understanding that you've been heading toward capture all along. $5,000. 3 hours underground. 12 people delivered directly to custody. That was the mathematics of modern border crossing, where even the tunnels designed to avoid detection led straight to cages, where freedom's light was just another trap, where desperate people crawled through darkness toward deportations that had been scheduled before they'd even entered the tunnel. Miguel had survived, returned home, rebuilt some semblance of life. But part of him was still in that tunnel, still crawling through mud toward a light that meant the opposite of what he'd hoped. Still discovering that some passages led not to new countries, but to the understanding that the real borders were the ones between hope and exploitation, between trust and betrayal, between the promises smugglers made and the cages that waited at the end of every tunnel.